In 1922, Japan signed on to the Washington Treaty. As a result, no more battleships could be built. The largest ships, except carriers, allowed were 10,000 tons armed with 8-inch guns. So they did what everyone else did. They started designing ships that were 10,000 tons with 8-inch guns. The result was that in late 1928, Japan began commissioning the 11,633-ton Myoko class. Let's dwell on this a little while. Again, with the signing of the Washington Treaty, battleship construction was mostly halted. Soon afterward, Japan started designs for cruisers that would be right up to the 10,000-ton 8-inch limit. Now, keeping weight down to get the most out of each ton was a matter of political limitation rather than just maximizing speed or controlling cost. That's not to say speed and cost weren't a factor. Remember, they still were expected to take part in the nighttime banzai charge of the U.S. battle fleet. As such, they had to be fast. This led to them totally eschewing coal for the complete use of oil. Cost and industrial capacity was also limited, though. For example, the second pair was started 4 months or a fiscal year after the first pair. Also, while the treaty set maximum gun size at 8-inch or 203 millimeter, the closest available was the 200 millimeter or 7.9 inch. Yes, this sounds superfluous, but the Japanese really wanted the best they could, so work started on developing a 203 millimeter gun from the existing 200 millimeter one. But due to cost and industrial capacity, it wasn't ready for these ships as they were completed. They would have to use the 200 millimeter gun until the new one was ready. To maximize firepower, though, the number of guns was increased from 3 twin turrets on the Aobas to 5 twin turrets on these ships, a characteristic that would be carried on for the next class regardless of stability or structural strength. You kind of get the feeling they were trying to build mini battleships as opposed to cruisers. Remember that as design work, as opposed to construction, began, they had already adopted the questionable techniques pioneered in Yubari, but neither she nor the follow-on Furutaka and Aoba classes had been completed yet. In fact, the first 2 Myokos were started only half a year-ish after the Aobas were. This meant that the overloaded condition of the previous ships wasn't realized yet. As such, giving the Japanese the benefit of the doubt here, this meant while these ships were originally intended to be 10,000 ton, they came out well over the limit at 11,633 ton standard displacement. The result was that, like their predecessors, they were overweight, top-heavy, structurally strained, and had a much lower freeboard than intended. Then came the Tomozuru and 4th Fleet incidents. As with other ships, they had to be worked on. This mostly involved stiffening the hull and frame and doing just enough to lower their center of gravity and improving stability to make them not dangerous. Then, just before the war, they were refitted again. As personal commentary, I find their wartime activity rather odd. With some exception, they mostly seemed to guard the East Indies once it was captured. This strikes me as rather wasteful of such powerful ships, while less capable ships were slogging it out around Guadalcanal. Maybe it was the fuel shortage. Maybe it was because they fundamentally considered the Solomons a backwater. Whatever. It did mean, though, they managed to survive longer than many other ships. I personally consider the sinking of Ashigara as the moment the IJN died. She really was the last large ship that had enough fuel and was in good enough condition to leave port. In short, she was the last ship that, for whatever reason, wasn't bottled up in port. That's just my opinion anyway.
私、妙高型従順洋艦、妙高と申します。共に頑張りましょう。
Myoko was started October 25th, 1924 and completed July 31st, 1929.
貴様が司令官か。私はナチ。よろしくお願いする。
Nachi was started November 26, 1924 and completed November 28, 1928.
ハグロです。妙高型従順洋艦姉妹の末っ子です。ごめんなさい。
Haguru was started March 16, 1925 and completed April 25, 1929.
足柄よ。砲雷撃戦が得意なの。 よろしくね。
Ashigara was started April 11th, 1925, and completed August 20th, 1929. Main armament was originally 10 200mm 50 caliber guns in 5 twin turrets, 3 forward and 2 aft. Secondary armament was 6 dual-purpose 120mm 45 caliber guns in 6 single open mounts midship, 3 on each side with 2 mounts on each side of the forward funnel and 1 on each side of the rear funnel. Torpedo armament was 12 24-inch tubes in 4 triple fixed banks built into the hull for the Type 90 torpedo, 2 banks on each side, essentially below the catapult. Propulsion was provided by 12 oil-burning boilers in 9 rooms. The first 3 rooms, each with 2 boilers, vented to the trunked forward funnels. The rear 6 rooms vented to the rear funnel. These provided steam to the 4 turbines, which generated 130,000 horsepower. Each of these in turn drove one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 35 knots. Like most other ships, they had 1 rudder. Protection was naturally improved. The main belt was 100mm and stretched from turret 1 to turret 5. 100mm bulkheads formed the ends of the armored box. The armored deck was 35mm over the magazines and 32mm over the machinery. In addition, the main deck had an additional 25mm, and the boiler uptakes had up to 88mm of armor. Barbette armor was 35mm, and turret armor was 25mm. Bulges were fitted on both sides that ran from turret 1 to turret 5. Conning tower armor was 16mm. Aircraft complement was 2 float planes that could be launched off the single catapult or stored in the hangar just in front of it on the center line between the rear funnel and turret 4. All 4 were modified for the war. Near the end of 1930, all had their forward funnel raised 2 meters to help keep smoke out of the bridge. Between 1931 and 1934, all 4 replaced their twin 200mm 50 caliber guns with 203mm 50 caliber guns. Between 1934 and 1935, all 4 were modified again. The 6 open 120mm 45 caliber anti-aircraft guns and hull-mounted torpedo tubes, along with the hangar and catapult, were removed. In their place was fitted 2 pairs of raised sponsons, 1 on each side of the bridge and forward funnel, another pair on each side of the rear funnel and raised flight deck. On these was fitted the new secondary armament of 4 twin 5-inch 40 caliber anti-aircraft guns, 2 on each side. At the end of the rear ones was mounted the new torpedo armament of 2 quad 24-inch mounts. 2 new catapults were fitted on either side of the flight deck, and aircraft complement went up to 4, though no more than 3 were usually carried. New bulges were also fitted to increase the depth of the TDS and restore lost buoyancy. All this meant displacement raised to 12,300 tons and lowered speed to 34 knots. Between 1939 and 1941, all 4 were modified again. The torpedo mounts were moved down to the main deck covered by cutouts in the superstructure, and the number of mounts was doubled to 4, 2 quadruple mounts on each side. Also, the torpedoes were upgraded to the Type 93 long lengths, and the forward mounts on each side carried reloads. More powerful catapults replaced the old ones. Some welded joints were replaced with rivets. Permanent ballast was fitted. New, wider bulges were fitted to improve stability, improve the TDS, and restore lost buoyancy. Displacement rose to 12,700 tons, and speed fell to 33 knots. In April 1943, Ashigara was fitted with the Type 21 radar. In June of 1943, Myoko and Haguru were fitted with the Type 21 radar. In August of 1943, Nachi was fitted with the Type 21 radar. In November of 1943, Nachi was fitted with the Type 22 radar. In March of 1944, Ashigara was fitted with the Type 22 radar. In late June of 1944, after the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Myoko and Haguru had their rear set of torpedo tubes removed on both sides and had Types 13 and 22 radar fitted. In September of 1944, Nachi and Ashigara had their rear sets of torpedo tubes removed on both sides and had Type 13 radar fitted. Myoko spent the first month of the war supporting the invasion of the southern Philippines. While in port at Davao on January 4, 1942, she was hit by a bomb from a B-17 that sent her back to Japan for repairs. With repairs complete, in late February she took part in the invasion of Java. Being part of the Western Force, she missed the Battle of the Java Sea proper, but did take part in finishing off Exeter and the destroyer encounter south of Borneo before returning to Japan in early March. In mid-April, she sailed south and escorted the carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea, sailing back home with them afterward. At the Battle of Midway, she covered the Midway invasion force, so wasn't directly involved in the battle. In late June, she escorted a convoy taking reinforcements to the newly captured Aleutians. In mid-August, she transferred a truck and promptly stayed there during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, guarding the pier. In late October, she covered the carriers during the Battle of Santa Cruz, but wasn't attacked, then returned to Japan in mid-November. In early December, she ferried troops to Rabaul, then transferred to Truk, where she essentially stayed. The only notable thing during this time was providing distant cover to the Guadalcanal evacuation force in early February. In early May of 1943, she returned to Japan, then transferred to the Aleutians until mid-June. With an overhaul completed in late July, she loaded troops and sailed again to Truk, arriving in early August. She then ran troops and supplies from Truk to Rabaul and back. At the start of November, she took part in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay. There, she collided with the destroyer and took several hits. The damage was bad enough that after the battle, she had to head back to Japan for repairs, arriving in mid-November. With repairs completed by mid-December, she was back at Truk by the end of the year. Still at Truk in mid-February, she, along with most other ships, gave up Truk as a base and transferred first to Palau, then the East Indies, arriving in mid-March. In early June of 1944, she sailed as part of the force taking reinforcements to Biak, New Guinea. With that completed, in mid-June, she joined the carriers again and took part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. At the battle, she herself wasn't damaged, but along with the fleet, she returned to Japan for repairs, refueling, and overhaul. In early July, she ferried supplies to the Philippines, then returned to the East Indies, arriving in mid-month. There she stayed until late October, when she sailed with center force to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At the Battle of the Sibuyan Sea, she was hit by an aircraft torpedo that wrecked her starboard propellers, cutting her top speed in half. Clearly unable to continue, she turned around and made her way back to Singapore, finally arriving there in early November. Patched up, she finally left Singapore for Japan in full repairs a month later on December 12th. Only a day later, at 9:40 p.m. on December 13th, she was hit at the stern by a torpedo from the submarine Burgle that destroyed her engines, leaving her dead in the water, flooding and burning. So bad was the damage that it took almost a week and a half, December 25th, of towing before she was finally back in Singapore. Completely beyond Singapore's ability to repair, her main gun ammunition was unloaded, and she was reclassified as a floating anti-aircraft platform.
また、来世で。さようなら。
At the end of the war, she was surrendered to the British and was scuttled in the Malacca Strait. Nachi also spent the first month of the war supporting the invasion of the southern Philippines. In January, she covered the invasion of the Celebes Islands and then Ambon. In early and mid-February, she covered the invasion of Makassar and then Timor. In late February, she was part of the Eastern Support Force and took part in the Battle of the Java Sea. Only days later, south of Borneo, she helped sink the British cruiser Exeter before returning to Japan in mid-March. With overhaul complete, she headed to the Aleutians and stayed there for 2.5 years. Highlights included covering the invasions of Attu and Kiska in early June of 1942 and taking part in the March 26, 1943 Battle of Komandorski, where she received only minor damage. Finally, in mid-September of 1944, she returned to Japan, and a month later, in mid-October, she sailed south to take part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf as part of the force meant to reinforce the southern force that was going to sail up through the Surigao Strait. At 4:30 a.m. on October 25th, as her force was heading north through the Surigao Strait, she collided with the battered Bogami, which was retreating south. The damage was bad. Nachi's bow was severely bent, and of course she began flooding, almost sinking by the bow. After refueling, she finally reached Manila for repairs on the 28th and was promptly attacked the next day by U.S. carrier aircraft, though the damage was light. On November 5th, Manila was attacked again, and this time Nachi wasn't as lucky. Between about 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., she was hit by about 16 rockets, 25 bombs, and 7 torpedoes.
私も散るのか。それもいいだろう。さらば。
With her bow and stern blown off, she sank 20 miles northwest of Corregidor at about 3 p.m. in only 100 feet of water. Needless to say, once the area was secured in March of 1945, U.S. naval intelligence divers had a field day scouring her wreck for anything useful. Haguru also spent the first month of the war supporting the invasion of the southern Philippines. In January, she covered the invasion of the Celebes Islands and then Ambon. In early and mid-February, she covered the invasion of Makassar and then Timor. In late February, she was part of the Eastern Support Force and took part in the Battle of the Java Sea. Days later, still with Nachi, south of Borneo, she helped sink the British cruiser Exeter, then returned to Japan in mid-March. In mid-April, she sailed south and escorted the big carriers at the Battle of the Coral Sea, then returned to Japan with them. At the Battle of Midway, she covered the Midway invasion force, so wasn't directly involved in the battle. In late June, she escorted a convoy taking reinforcements to the newly captured Aleutians. In mid-August, she transferred a truck and stayed there during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In late September, she returned to Japan for an overhaul that lasted until late November. She then returned a truck in early December, ferrying troops to Rabaul on the way. In early February, she provided distant cover for the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Then in May, returned to Japan, where she first was assigned to the aborted effort to reinforce Attu, but was then reassigned to the Aleutian Force, where she spent most of June and July. In late July, she ferried troops back to Truk, arriving in mid-August. In early November, she took part in the Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, where she was hit and had to reduce speed. After the battle, she returned to Truk, then to Japan for permanent repairs, arriving in mid-November. With repairs and modifications completed, she arrived back at Truk at the end of December 1943. When Truk became undefensible, she left Truk for Palau on February 10, 1944. She then sailed to Borneo, back to Palau, then to the southern Philippines, then to Singapore, arriving in mid-April. In late May, she took part in the reinforcement of Biak on the southern coast of northern New Guinea. In mid-June, she rejoined the carriers and escorted them at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where she herself wasn't damaged but returned with the battered fleet to Japan after the battle. In early July, she ferried troops to the Philippines, then continued on back to Singapore, arriving in the middle of the month. In late October, as part of Center Force, she took part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At the Battle of Samar, an aircraft bomb destroyed Turret 3, which was never repaired. Aside from that, she suffered little other damage, and by the end of the month, she was back at port in the East Indies. In early November, while the larger ships that needed repairs headed back to Japan, she remained in the East Indies with the other operational ships. In mid-December, she towed the wounded Myoko back to Singapore. In April, she began raining supplies from Singapore to Japanese garrisons in the Bay of Bengal and Burma. While returning from one such aborted mission, at 1:14 a.m. on May 16, 1945, while northeast of Sabang, and escorted by the destroyer Kamikaze, she was attacked by 5 British destroyers. Despite her No. 3 turret having had its barrels removed and never repaired, she fought back, but was outnumbered and outmaneuvered.
あの子たち、ちゃんと逃げ切れたかな。もう、何も見えない。
Having been hit by at least 3 torpedoes and many shells, she finally sank bow first at about 2:30 a.m. Ashigara spent the first 2 months of the war covering the invasion of the northern Philippines. In mid-February, she covered the invasion of first Borneo and then the Celebes. At the end of February, she was part of the Western Force, so missed the Battle of the Java Sea, but did help sink the British cruiser Exeter. In late March, she supported the invasion of Christmas Island. For the most part, she then remained in the East Indies until the end of February 1944, when she returned to Japan, then transferred to northern waters until the start of August 1944, when she returned to southern Japan. In late October, she sailed as part of the support group meant to reinforce Southern Force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. In other words, from March of 1942 to September of 1944, she essentially did nothing meaningful. After the disastrous Battle of Surigao Strait, she returned to the East Indies at the end of the month. In late December of 1944, she took part in the raid to bombard the American beachhead at San Jose in the northern Philippines before returning to the East Indies. Despite being successful, the day before the bombardment, the 26th, she was hit by an aircraft bomb that damaged her. Repairs at Singapore took almost a month. While ferrying troops with the destroyer Kamikaze from Java to Singapore through the Bangka Strait at 12:15 p.m. on June 8, 1945, she was hit by 5 torpedoes from the British submarine Tennant.
勝利だけが私の誇りだったのに。
Already listing heavily, burning and dead in the water, at 12:37 she finally rolled over and sank.